how to win a trade war. So, if you've been watching the news and if you're watching this channel, you probably know what's going on. The United States has launched this trade war against China specifically, but kind of the whole world. And I want to talk about how the US could win it or could have won it had they actually planned accordingly, and talk kind of where we are today and why China has the upper hand, and kind of talk about where we might be able to go from this. And I guess the first way to win a trade war is to not start one. That concludes my TED Talk. Thanks for coming. No, jokes aside. The first thing is to not start a trade war, especially with your allies. So the United States, Donald Trump, it's not even the United States, it's really Trump, has decided to launch a tariff war, a trade war against its closest allies, Canada and Mexico. So these are kind of the biggest trading partners of the United States, along with China. So those are the top three. And, a lot of people, even in my last video when I was talking about the trade war and what was going on, a lot of people were saying that, it's a national security risk, that all of our manufacturing is coming from China and other countries. That was kind of the general sentiment in the comments that were leaning towards bringing manufacturing back to the United States. And totally get that from a standpoint of national security. I'm not defending it. I don't think that it's necessarily the right way to go about it, but I can understand that thought pattern. People were talking about pharmaceuticals and military hardware and things like that, and saying that we get a lot of our pharmaceuticals from China or from India or from other countries, and we get a lot of our chips, high-tech chips from China specifically, that end up in military hardware. So they were saying this is a problem and we should bring manufacturing back to the United States of key industries. And I say, sure, let's engage in that conversation and talk about how a country can win a trade war. And the way that we need to look at this is look at history, because China has won round two. And the United States, or the West and China, have been essentially in a trade war for a very long time. And you can say the first time China entered into this was when the Western powers arrived in Asia and they started to carve up China. And this is the UK or England took over Hong Kong, the Portuguese took over Macau, and you had concessions in Shanghai, which was basically took over by the French. And this is why you can go to Shanghai today and go to the French concession. There was all these little carve-outs all along the coast, and there's still history of that today. If you go to China and you visit, you can go to these places. And Japan had kind of the northern part of China, Manchurian, which they were occupying. And so the first kind of trade war between kind of the Western powers in China was won by the West. And the reason China lost was because they had entered a period of isolation, which should ring a bell. They had entered a period of isolation where they weren't really trading with the outside world, and the outside world surpassed them. So when the Western powers showed up, they had more technology, they had better equipment, so to say, and they were able to essentially dominate China. This led to the century of humiliation, as they call it, and it was basically until after World War II and after the Chinese Revolution that the communists came into power in 1949, and that's when they started the second round, I would say, of the trade war. Because before that, the nationalist government was somewhat beholden to Western powers, and they didn't really have the strength to combat or even engage in equal terms with the Western power. And that's why the communists rose to power. So Once the communists took over, they started to try to settle things within the country. And what happened was a couple of failed policies under Mao with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. But eventually they got their house in order. And around I believe 1978 or 79, Deng Xiaoping went to the south and he started what I would consider the second phase of the trade war. This is really when Deng Xiaoping said, white cat, black cat, whatever catches the mouse is a good cat. And basically he said, by any means necessary, we are going to advance. And this is what China has been doing ever since. You could say in the 80s, they started to set up some of their economic zones, which allowed for reduced restrictions on trade. So they started to kind of create these free trade zones around Shanghai and around Shenzhen and around other parts. I think now I have to look it up, but 8 or 9 what they call kind of like free trade zones, which is the businesses that are set up in those areas and do business through those areas have fewer restrictions on imports and exports. Essentially, they said we need to play the capitalistic game in order to win that game. And so from the 80s until now, that's what China has been doing. They've been working diligently and very hard in order to be in the position they are today, where they are surpassing the United States in manufacturing. They are surpassing the United States in collectively the West in most key areas at this point. There are a few high-tech areas that they're still engaged in and trying to win, so to say. You could say chips is one of them. They're trying to make the smallest, most advanced computer chips. They've done very well, but they're on the last leg of solving that problem. And that's pretty much the last frontier, so to say, other than future tech, that China is not winning or dominating. If you think of wind power, you think of solar power, you think of just everyday manufacturing. Look what's happening in the United States right now. The United States imports are plummeting because nobody can afford the tariffs. So if you're watching the news or if you're in the United States, you're probably worried right now that there could be shortages as soon as 3 weeks, to 6 weeks to a couple of months out. We could be seeing shortages in the United States because if you have 145% tariff on all goods from one of your largest trading partners, to the point that basically nobody can import anymore, and then on top of that you put 25% tariffs on your other two biggest trading partners, whether it's steel or auto parts or anything else, which is Canada and Mexico, you all of a sudden create a supply shock because it becomes extremely expensive to import those goods. So what the United States has done has basically gone about this in a completely wrong way. So China won round 2. The Western powers, including the United States to some extent, not as much as the European powers, but the United States was there when the Western powers showed up to China the first time. China lost that one, and you look at the history, that's clear. They said never again because they didn't want to be humiliated the way they perceived their humiliation, which, they were carved up. And so they said never again. And for the last, from the 80s until now, so I guess you could say the last 60 years, they've been working hard to win round 2, and they've won it. Look at any of the trade data from not just the United States and China, but China and the rest of the world. China is the largest trading partner for most of the world at this point. They call it the world's factory for a reason. They won round 2. We are currently in round 3, and China has the advantage because they have done all the work to set up all their manufacturing to be in the position that they are right now. The only thing that the United States or kind of the Western powers have are a few very specialized areas like semiconductors, chips, that they are still a little bit ahead. But that gap is closing every day. And you can see it with the news. Every day, China's coming up with new chips that are smaller. And, some of the people will say, oh, they're 2 years behind. They're, 4 years behind, whatever. I think the last report I was saying was they were saying, oh, this chip that China has recently talked about is still 2 years behind. And that's actually quite telling, because last year they were saying they were 5 years behind. And before that, the year before that, they were saying they were 8 to 10 years behind. So they are catching up. And you can go look at the reports. There's plenty of news reports where people saying, oh, China's 5 years out before they can be at the same level of advanced chips that Taiwan makes or that the United States and kind of the West controls. And then, go a few years back, they were saying there was 10 years, 8 to 10 years before China catches up. Now they're saying they're only 2 years behind. So give it another year, they'll be a year behind. And another year, they'll be at the same level. So this trade war that has started is pretty telling of where China is currently and where kind of the United States specifically, but kind of the West is. And that brings us to essentially this is round 3. Who's going to win round 3? Well, right now it's unclear. And it's unclear because there are a lot of things that could be done from both sides that could help or hurt their cause. The way that you win a trade war, and this is just my suggestions, or how I would have done it if I was in charge. China took 40 to 60 years to get to the position that they are in now, and that's about as long as it would take for the United States to get into the position to be able to essentially compete on the same level. Now, China was starting from 0. The United States is not starting from 0, so you could say, let's have that. But to get to a same competitive level where they could be the largest exporter to most of the world, the United States could be the largest exporter to most of the world, you will need 20 years. And you'll need to do a couple of things that I don't think the United States is willing or able to do. So let's talk about it. One, the United States would have to devalue the currency of the dollar to a point that would bankrupt the United States. This is not something they are capable of doing. The United States dollar is the world reserve currency right now. And in order to make your products competitive on the global stage, you would have to have a dollar that is significantly weaker to the local currencies that you're trying to sell your products into. Because if China continues, which there's no reason for them not to continue, to produce a lot of goods for the world, their products will be cheaper because their dollar or their renminbi is weak compared to the US dollar, and it's weaker compared to other currencies around the world. So when they export their goods, or when other countries import goods from Chinese manufacturers, the costs are lower in their local currency, so to say. It's cheaper to import those than to make them domestically. And this is what the United States is going to find, is that even if you wanted to manufacture most of your goods in the United States, and it is possible, but the issue is nobody outside of the United States will be able to afford it or even want to afford it because you're still competing with Chinese goods, which are significantly cheaper. So the United States would have to weaken its currency to a point where it would bankrupt its economy. Right now it is weakening, so that's, I guess, a positive. Because those goods being exported to, say, Europe would have to be affordable. Because you're still competing with Chinese goods that are affordable currently. And that's not going to change anytime soon. So first you'd have to devalue your currency to a point that would bankrupt you. So that's not really possible, which is why the United States is in a bad position in terms of just that alone. Then you'd have to build out your supply chains. And you're still competing with China. China's built out their supply chains for the last 40 to 60 years. And that's one of the reasons why manufacturing in China is very cheap. So the United States would have to build out its supply chains. And, some people are arguing that it's not such a big deal, but it is. You still have to reshore those supply chains, meaning The way China, and I talked about this in the last video, the way China is set up is that there are entire cities devoted to one type of production, whether that is electronics, whether that is sneakers, whether that is clothing, whether that is like decorations for, holiday decorations, whether it's, Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving and all the stuff that gets sold around the world. Even like simpler things, just like labeling and plastic and stuff. There's towns and there's entire areas in towns that are devoted to one specific product, so to say. You'd have to figure out how to get all those supply chains in the United States because that's one way they keep the cost low. To do that, it's going to take time. Again, China's been doing this for the last 40 to 60 years. They've been actively working on developing this ecosystem in order to be the world's factory. It didn't happen overnight. And that's what I think the United States has to realize. It's not going to happen overnight if they want to win this trade war. It's short-term pain, as they say, for long-term gain. They are correct. But the problem is the short term is relative. How long can the United States survive in the short-term pain? Because China has been enduring that pain for 40 years. I don't know how else to explain that. You have people in China, and although their incomes have increased, and although their lives have increased and become better, and their standards of living have increased, they had many, many, many years of pain. You're talking 40 years of pain to now be in the position where their middle class is the largest in the world, and they actually can afford nicer things. But you're talking 40 years of pain. 40 years of people who went to the factory 7 days a week and for really long hours in order to put their kids into school, in order for their kids to have a better life. And their kids now are doing the same thing. They are working those long hours and those hard jobs in order to put their kids into university and to have the opportunities that they themselves didn't have. So you're talking about 3 generations of people that were working very hard to get the country to where it is today. The United States would have to hunker down and say it's going to be 2 to 3 generations of really hard work in order to get the United States to a place that China is today. All the while, China's not going to stop. Right? China's not going to be like, okay, all right, we're going to just hold everything at the level that it is today, and we'll let the United States catch up. We'll let everybody else catch up to us. That's not going to happen. China, even today, is actively opening up factories in other countries in order to do exactly what they did in their own country, which is build out the manufacturing, build out the supply chains, and do it in an area where those people are not as well off as Chinese are currently. So, all right, you've committed to it. You've decided that you are going to commit to this trade war. You devalue your currency. You tell your people that they're going to have to endure short-term pain, but in reality, it's going to be long-term pain. And you start opening up manufacturing in the United States. You start finding places where you can set up supply chains near ports. You build your infrastructure, because that's the other thing. China has been building their infrastructure for the last 60 years. They have trains. They have highways. They have all the ports and airports and all the things that you need in order to be a manufacturing country. Government's got to invest in that, right? The United States infrastructure has F rating. You can't transport all the goods and all of the stuff that you need in order to become a manufacturing superpower with the United States' current infrastructure. Okay, the government decides we're going to invest billions of dollars in our infrastructure. Okay, so you've devalued your currency, you've started opening new manufacturing plants, you've started to redevelop your infrastructure. Now you got to train your people. Okay, well, how long does it take to train people? Well, depends on the people. but you're going to have to retool your entire education system in order to develop the talent that you need in order to be a manufacturing superpower. Okay, that's going to take some years too. All right, okay. We're looking at 20 years still. What else do we need to do in order to compete at this level? Well, devalue your currency, you start building manufacturing, you start building infrastructure, you start focusing on school and education because that's a very key component, especially since a lot of the manufacturing is now automated. So you need to have skilled technicians who can manage those factories. When the automation breaks down, you need somebody who can do the coding. You need somebody who can come in and actually do the repairs on robotics. What else do we need? Well, what else do we need? We need investment, because where is this all going to come from? You can put it on the national credit card, but that's already maxed out. As we can see in the bond market, nobody wants to take on US debt right now. So how are you actually going to manage all this? Especially if your currency is being devalued, where are you going to get the investment to build all this? Okay, let's say we can get some of our allies who we've pissed off. Let's say that we can convince them that this is in their best interest too, that buying from the United States is better than buying from China. Good luck with that, but let's say you can figure that out while also putting tariffs on them. But let's say you can figure that out and they start investing. Maybe you can get some foreign investment. So honestly, where are you going to get the money to rebuild your roads, rebuild your education system, and rebuild your factories and rebuild your supply chains? On top of that, we have our supply chains in order, we have our education in order, and we have our currency devalued. We still need raw inputs. Talking about like the actual rare earth materials, like the raw inputs. Okay, where are we going to get that? Well, we got to start from the basics, so I guess we have to start with those first. We got to build those facilities to mine rare earth, to refine rare earth, and then to distribute rare earth. Oh man, this seems like a lot of work and it's going to take a lot of time. Can the US do this? Because this is just scratching the surface. I haven't even gotten into all of the nitty gritty. This is literally high level thought here. This isn't even like getting down to the nuts and bolts that you have to buy to like to build the manufacturing plants, or the labor to build new roads and bridges and to build factories. And then once you have all the infrastructure set up, to actually have people come in and do the jobs. Even if you have automation, you still need people to build the automated factory. You still need the roads and the bridges and the railroads and the ports. You still need all of that to make sense. And this is what China's been doing for the last 40 years. They've been building all of this. This is why they are where they are today. And this is why they have a massive advantage, because on top of that, let's say the United States goes down this road and says it's a 20-year plan because somehow the politics in the United States can stick to a 20-year plan. We aren't even talking about that. But let's say they can figure it out and say, all right, here's the plan that we're setting forth for the United States. We're going to tell all our partners, and everybody can be clear and certain on what the United States is doing. They may not agree with it, but it's clear and it's not changing every day. Can you actually do that? Can you have a 20-year plan and not be turned over in 2 years when a new Congress comes in, or 4 years when a new president comes in? The insanity of this is, I'm talking about how can the United States win a trade war? You tell me at this point. The only way you win a trade war, again, is at the original start where I said you don't start one. And you definitely don't start one with your allies. So how could have the United States gone about this? Well, they could have went to their allies and said, hey, China's been dumping in Europe. China's been dumping, whether it's true or not. This is what they believe, and this is what they've been talking about. They say, hey, look, China's been trying to dump EVs in Europe. They've been trying to dump other stuff, products in Europe. They've been trying to dump it in the United States. They've been trying to dump it in Canada and Australia and all these other places where the United States had goodwill and was considered an ally. They could have went to their allies and said, we have a plan. It's going to take 10 years, but what we're going to do is isolate China to the point that that isolation creates a collapse within China. And the way we're going to do that is we'll get our 15 key allies, the European Union, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Canada, Mexico, and whoever else we can scoop up in this net that we consider our allies. We are all going to put a 15% tariff on Chinese goods across the board. It's not enough to stop trade, but it is enough to shift production. And what I mean by that is some companies would start saying, you know what, we could probably shift our manufacturing away from China. We can find another ally over the next 10 years, because the United States will say this is a 10-year plan, and we will start shifting, because that's the point. These 15 to 20 powerful economies that the United States has come together to create a trading bloc are going to shift away from China. And that could be any other country. It could be India. It could be within their own trade partnership, where they say we want to be, in 10 years, 75% trading within our own bloc, meaning we only buy from each other, and that last 25% can come from the rest of the world. You start building that out. This is how you actually win the trade war. You start building that out, and you go to those other allies. You go to the European Union, you go to Canada, you go to Mexico, you go to Australia, and you say, in order for you to find this beneficial, we will create a new trading structure that reduces tariffs. You don't put a blanket tariff on all of your allies of 10%, and you don't put a tariff of 25% on, key imports like steel and aluminium. You don't do that. You go to those other nations and you say, hey, we want to buy your steel from Australia. We want to buy your beef from Australia. And, we want to buy your products instead of going to China. Is there anything that Australia has that they could start manufacturing that would benefit the United States and actually replace China? Can Australia make rare earth minerals, right? Can they create a plant and then start exporting to the United States at a reasonable cost? Because if you put a 10 or 15% on all things coming from China, then that gives them a margin to work with. If they can at least get that close enough to that same price, then you could just start importing from Australia. You could import from Canada. You could import from Mexico. Very much like the United States was doing before Trump had this idea that he was going to make a lot of money for the United States by taxing U.S. citizens and U.S. businesses. Doesn't make any sense. The tariffs have never worked. Not broad tariffs. You can talk about very specific tariffs are beneficial, but then you have to be specific. You can't have blanket tariffs. You want to win a trade war, you go to your partners and you say, how do we isolate China? Because that's their main target. And how do we actually spur trade between our nations so that we aren't reliant on China? We aren't reliant on Asia as a whole. How do we bring those jobs back, and how do we create trade between ourselves? And then all of a sudden you have allies, partners who are like, yes, that actually benefits all of us. That makes a lot of sense. Europe and the United States are now working closer together instead of Europe being like, well, whatever, you're doing your thing. We don't want to be a part of it. Screw you, right? You don't antagonize all of your allies. You actually bring them together and you say, how do we actually subsidize? Because again, if you want to build out new factories, you got to subsidize it. You got to provide the energy, whether that's coal, you got to put new power plants in, whether that's coal or natural gas or solar or nuclear. You got to actually put a lot of work into building out the infrastructure that's needed to win the trade war. Putting a tariff on the whole world is probably the stupidest way to go about this. But again, I don't care, because I think China will win it. And I think the United States is being exposed for the fact that they have no leadership, for the fact that they can't plan 2 weeks ahead, let alone 20 years ahead. And I think we're seeing fractures. Because now it really is. Do you stick with the United States that has no plan? Or do you keep buying cheap goods from China, where at least it's not going to really affect your day-to-day? All of a sudden, Australia's getting new contracts for beef from China because they stopped buying it from the United States. Brazil's getting new contracts for soybeans because they decided not to buy it from the United States anymore. All of a sudden, these other trading partners that have been trading successfully with China for many years are being incentivized to continue trading with China because there's deals to be made, and the United States has no plan. The United States is saying, come in and give us a deal. Okay, why? It's beyond stupid. So again, I guess at the end of this rant, I can say there is no way to win a trade war. There are some ways that you can go about it to make your chances higher, but when you're competing with the world's manufacturer and you don't have a solid plan, you are going to end up with empty shelves. So I guess that's the lesson that we've learned is if you're taking on the largest manufacturer in the world, you better damn well have a plan. And if you don't, then maybe don't go down that road. Maybe the only way to win is to not start a trade war. Anyways, there's a lot of things that I'm sure I've missed, but those are the big ones I feel from, getting your supply chain in order, getting your infrastructure in order, getting your people in order, and devaluing your currency. That's basically how you compete. And by doing that, you destroy your country. So, I don't know. What do you guys think? Leave a comment below, and I will see you in the next video.